When I went into labor, I thought I'd have my husband by my side. It was supposed to be one of those unforgettable, bonding experiences, the type that brings you closer, that reminds you why you're together. But reality had other plans. I'll never forget the look on his face when he got that text. We were in the hospital room. My contractions were getting stronger, and just when I thought he was about to squeeze my hand and reassure me, his phone dinged. He glanced down, his expression shifting from tense to outright panic. I could tell something was wrong, but his reaction stunned me. Without a word, he stood up, grabbed his things, and said, "I need to go. It's my sister. It's an emergency." I tried to stop him, to understand what was happening. "You're leaving now?" I asked, half expecting him to break into laughter and say it was a bad joke. But he didn't. Instead, he gave me a quick, almost dismissive hug, mumbled that he'd be back soon, and disappeared out the door. I was left lying there, gasping through contractions, alone in a sterile room. My mind raced. What could possibly be so urgent that he'd abandon me in the middle of labor? I clung to the idea that this must be serious. Maybe his sister was in danger. Maybe she was in the hospital too. Maybe. I don't know. I just knew he wouldn't leave me for anything less. Hours ticked by, and my labor progressed without him. Nurses came and went, offering sympathy and half-hearted jokes to distract me, but I could see the pity in their eyes. My mom eventually arrived and tried to fill the void he'd left, but even she was furious when I explained what happened. She couldn't believe he'd walked out, and honestly, neither could I. By the time I was holding our baby in my arms, my anger was starting to grow. I had just brought our child into the world, and he had missed it. Not because of a real emergency I suspected, but because of some excuse I didn't understand. The following day, I tried calling him. Voicemail. I texted, left messages, called his parents, nothing. He was just gone. I started to panic. What if something had actually happened to him? Maybe his sister's emergency had escalated into something more serious. But as the hours turned to days, my worry turned back to anger. And then, finally, he came home. When he walked through the door, I felt a mixture of relief, confusion, and fury. He looked exhausted, almost as if he'd gone through labor himself. But as soon as he saw me holding our baby, he hesitated, like he was a stranger in his own house. I wanted to scream, to ask a million questions, but I held back, trying to let him explain first. He started with a mumble about how his sister had been in crisis and how he didn't have a choice. I let him talk, my patience wearing thin as he rambled. But when I pressed him for specifics, his answers got vague. He wouldn't look me in the eye, and his excuses started to sound like they were rehearsed. Finally, he gave in and admitted that his sister's emergency wasn't life-threatening. She was upset over some personal issue, he said, something she'd only wanted to talk about with him. That was the moment I felt something inside me snap. He'd left me alone in labor for that? I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process his words. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal, it was overwhelming. And he looked shocked, genuinely shocked, when I finally spoke up and told him I wanted a divorce. In the days that followed, the tension between us only grew thicker. He seemed to think I'd eventually get over it once things calmed down, that I'd somehow understand and forgive him for leaving me alone during one of the most vulnerable moments of my life. But every time I looked at him, a new wave of anger surged up. I kept replaying his excuses in my mind, trying to understand why he thought his sister's personal issues could ever justify abandoning his wife in labor. When I told a close friend what happened, she was horrified. She had been with her husband for the birth of both their children, and she said she couldn't imagine him ever leaving her side. "You deserve to know the whole truth," she said, encouraging me to dig deeper. And so, I started asking questions, hoping for clarity, but bracing myself for whatever I might find. At first, he refused to discuss it. Anytime I brought it up, he'd shut down, insisting he didn't want to talk about it. But I wouldn't let it go. Every time he dodged my questions, my suspicions only grew. Finally, after a heated argument one evening, he slipped up, revealing a detail he hadn't mentioned before. It turned out his sister wasn't even in the same city when she had her so-called emergency. She had texted him from her apartment 100 miles away, asking him to come see her. Something about his story wasn't adding up. Why would he leave me during labor to drive hours away for a simple conversation? And why did he feel so compelled to keep this from me? I confronted him about the distance, demanding to know why he'd go so far on such short notice. That's when he blurted out something that shook me to my core. She needed me, he said, avoiding eye contact. She was dealing with some stuff that I can't get into. Family stuff. Family stuff? I was his family, standing in front of him with our newborn in my arms, and he still wouldn't open up. The way he spoke about his sister, like she was the priority in his life, left me speechless. It made me feel like I was just another person he shared a house with, not the partner he'd promised to love and support. I felt a pang of resentment, realizing I had been second to his sister all along. The more I pressed him, the more details came to light, and the story kept changing. First, it was an emergency, then it was a personal crisis. Eventually, he admitted it wasn't a crisis at all. She was having a tough time in her relationship, and he had felt obligated to be there for her. Obligation. That word sat in my chest like a stone. He felt obligated to his sister, but apparently, he didn't feel the same for me and our child. As I pieced together the scattered fragments of his story, I began to see a pattern. His sister had always been the one who needed saving, and he had always been the one to come running, no matter the cost. Every time she had a problem, he'd drop everything to help her, even if it meant leaving me behind. This wasn't the first time he'd prioritized her over me, but it was the first time it had impacted me in such a significant, life-altering way. I was shaken, furious, and confused. How had I never seen this side of him before? How could he justify leaving me alone in such a critical moment? I started wondering if there was something more to this relationship between him and his sister, some kind of dependency that went beyond ordinary sibling support. He tried to brush it off, saying he just had to be there for her, but his reluctance to let me in on the details made me feel like an outsider in my own marriage. One evening, when I was rocking our baby to sleep, I began to wonder if there was something I hadn't been willing to see. Could it be that he was more committed to his sister than he was to me? The thought was both absurd and heartbreaking, but I couldn't shake it. All the little signs I'd brushed off over the years suddenly seemed glaringly obvious. The missed dates, the canceled plans, the times he'd leave in the middle of the night to help her with something. It was like his life revolved around her, and I was just an afterthought. Fueled by hurt and anger, I decided I couldn't ignore this any longer. If I was going to make sense of it all, I needed to understand the full story. I started reaching out to people who might know more, mutual friends, family members, anyone who might have some insight. And what I uncovered only added to my sense of betrayal. One friend told me they'd seen my husband with his sister at a restaurant the night before I went into labor. They seemed deep in conversation, and from what my friend could overhear, they were arguing. Apparently, his sister was upset about something personal, and my husband was trying to reassure her. He'd spent hours with her that night, leaving her place just before midnight. And he hadn't mentioned any of this to me. Not a word. This wasn't just a case of a sibling asking for support. This was a pattern, a habit he couldn't break. His sister's needs came first, no matter what. And in that moment, I realized that if I stayed in this marriage, I'd always be competing with her. I'd always be the one left behind while he ran to rescue her from whatever latest crisis she'd created. I knew, deep down, that I deserved better than that. By the time I confronted him again, my mind was made up. I looked him in the eye and told him I wanted out. I couldn't stay in a marriage where I was constantly second to someone else, where my needs and our child's needs would always be an afterthought. And this time, he couldn't brush it off. He couldn't dismiss my pain or guilt-trip me into staying. But his reaction was anything but what I'd expected. Instead of understanding or remorse, he was shocked. He genuinely seemed blindsided by my decision, as if he hadn't even considered the possibility that his actions might have consequences. He kept asking, "Why now? Why are you giving up on us?" And each time he asked, it felt like a slap in the face. In that moment, I realized that he would never see things from my perspective. He was so deeply enmeshed in his relationship with his sister that he couldn't fathom why anyone else would have a problem with it. And for the first time in years, I felt a sense of clarity. I knew I had to leave, not just for me, but for our child. We both deserved a life where we came first, not second to someone else's constant demands. After that confrontation, things went from strained to unbearable. He couldn't accept that I was serious about leaving, let alone that his actions had driven me to this point. He kept asking me to reconsider, to give him another chance, to prove that he could be a better husband and father. But each plea felt hollow. Every promise reminded me of the night he'd left me alone, and I knew deep down that nothing he could say would change what I had seen in him. But just as I was gathering my resolve to move forward with the divorce, he hit me with something unexpected, a desperate proposition. He said that if I agreed to stay, he'd cut contact with his sister. He promised he'd put our marriage first, that he'd finally break free of whatever hold she had over him. Part of me wanted to believe him, to think that maybe there was still a way to rebuild the trust he'd shattered. But something about his sudden willingness to sever ties with his own family felt strange. It was almost too easy, too convenient. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, that his sister's emergency wasn't as innocent as he'd tried to make it seem. I knew I couldn't move forward until I understood what had truly happened that night. So, I decided to dig a little deeper, this time without his knowledge. I started with his phone records. I knew it was an invasion of privacy, but I was beyond caring about crossing lines.
What I found sent a chill down my spine.
On the night he'd left me, there had been dozens of calls and texts exchanged between him and his sister, stretching back hours before he'd supposedly received her emergency text. The conversation had started long before I went into labor, and from the timestamps, it looked like they'd been planning something for days. I didn't have to wait long to uncover the truth. One of his friends, someone who'd been around him and his sister often, reached out to me unexpectedly. This friend, let's call him Ryan, was close with my husband in college, but they drifted apart over the years. Ryan had heard about our situation through mutual friends, and he said he needed to tell me something that had been weighing on him for a long time. According to Ryan, this wasn't the first time my husband had lied to me about his sister's emergencies. He revealed that their bond went beyond the usual sibling closeness. It was something obsessive, almost codependent. Ryan described instances from years back when my husband would abandon plans, skip work, even break off relationships to be by his sister's side whenever she demanded it. And every time, she'd reel him back in with stories of crises or breakdowns that, in retrospect, seemed manufactured. The worst part? Ryan told me he suspected that his sister's so-called emergency during my labor wasn't an emergency at all. Instead, he believed she'd staged the whole thing, knowing it would pull him away from me at the worst possible time. Apparently, she'd never been a fan of me, feeling as though I was taking him away from her. She saw me as a threat, an obstacle in their strange, twisted dynamic. The weight of it all hit me like a freight train. His sister hadn't just disrupted our lives, she'd actively sabotaged us. And he had let her. He had chosen her manipulation over his commitment to me and our child. It was no longer just about a mistake he'd made on a single night. It was about a pattern of toxic loyalty, a cycle he was trapped in and refused to break. And now I knew that, no matter what he said, he would always put her needs above ours. I confronted him with the phone records, hoping that maybe this time, faced with undeniable proof, he'd finally own up to the truth. But instead, he doubled down, accusing me of being paranoid and claiming that Ryan was jealous and out to ruin his life. He couldn't see how deep this betrayal cut me, how his refusal to acknowledge his sister's manipulation only confirmed that I was making the right decision. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, my mind racing, I had an epiphany. If he was willing to go to such lengths to defend her, to sacrifice our family without a second thought, then I needed to make a clean break. There was no saving this marriage, no salvaging a relationship that had been doomed from the start. The next morning, I told him I was filing for divorce. At first, he was speechless, staring at me like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then, as the reality sank in, he went from shock to rage. He accused me of being cold-hearted, of throwing away our marriage over a minor issue. I could see the desperation in his eyes, the anger that masked his fear. He knew he was losing control, and it terrified him. But just when I thought he'd finally accepted the end, he hit me with another twist, a threat. He warned me that if I went through with the divorce, he'd fight me for custody. He claimed that I was unstable, that my resentment toward his sister was proof I couldn't provide a healthy environment for our child. It was a low blow, and I could see the satisfaction in his face as he watched my reaction, like he'd finally found a way to hurt me as much as I was hurting him. But instead of breaking down, his words steeled my resolve. If he thought he could use our child as leverage, he was gravely mistaken. I knew the truth, and now I had the evidence to prove it. I wouldn't let him manipulate me into staying in a marriage built on lies and betrayal. In the weeks that followed, I started preparing for the legal battle. I gathered every piece of evidence I could find, from the phone records to testimonies from friends who had witnessed his twisted loyalty to his sister. I was ready to fight for my freedom, for a chance to build a life where I was no longer trapped in a shadow. But just as I was about to file the papers, another bombshell dropped. Just when I thought I had seen the worst of it, his family intervened. I got a call from his mother, someone who had always been kind to me, urging me to reconsider. She said that divorcing him would destroy the family and that I needed to forgive him for our child's sake. But her tone wasn't one of sympathy. It was cold and forceful, as if I was merely a piece in a game they were determined to win. It dawned on me that this wasn't just about my husband and his sister. It was a family dynamic far deeper than I'd realized. The conversation took an unexpected turn when she revealed that his sister had already contacted her, claiming I was overreacting and unstable. Apparently, they'd all heard a version of events where I was the villain, painting myself as a woman trying to drive a wedge between siblings. They weren't rallying to save our marriage. They were closing ranks, protecting each other from what they saw as an outsider trying to break them apart. I was furious, but also deeply hurt. I'd always believed that his family liked and respected me. To realize they were willing to rewrite history just to keep up appearances shook me to my core. Even though I'd seen my husband's toxic bond with his sister firsthand, I never thought his entire family would choose to protect such dysfunction over supporting what was right. It felt like a betrayal on a whole new level. Determined not to back down, I moved forward with my preparations. But in the midst of everything, another twist came crashing into my life, this time from a completely unexpected source. I received a message from a woman I didn't recognize. She introduced herself as someone who'd been involved with my husband years ago, long before we'd met. Her story left me speechless. According to her, his sister had caused the end of their relationship as well. She recounted eerily familiar situations, emergencies, constant interruptions, demands that her brother abandon any plans that didn't include her. The woman explained that my husband had always been under his sister's thumb, unable to break free, and it had ultimately led to the collapse of their relationship. She warned me that as long as his sister remained in the picture, he'd never be able to fully commit to anyone else. Her message was the final confirmation of everything I feared. This pattern wasn't new, and I wasn't the first to suffer because of it. It was clear that he was stuck in a cycle of dependency, one he couldn't or wouldn't escape. It explained so much, yet it also left me feeling empty, realizing that I'd invested years into a relationship that was never truly mine. Around this time, I learned from a mutual friend that his sister was planning an elaborate celebration for her upcoming birthday. Apparently, the whole family was in on it, eager to throw her a party to celebrate life after her recent emergency. The audacity of it all struck me hard. Here they were, planning a grand affair for a woman who'd faked an emergency to sabotage my labor, while I was left picking up the pieces of a marriage she'd been allowed to destroy. They were blind to her manipulations, seeing her only as the family's darling who could do no wrong. Fueled by a mix of frustration and newfound clarity, I made a decision. I would attend her birthday celebration, not as a dutiful family member, but to confront them all face to face. This was no longer just about my husband's betrayal. It was about their entire family dynamic, one that had quietly tolerated and even enabled her manipulation. If they were going to stand by her, I wanted them to hear the truth from my mouth. The day of the party, I arrived unannounced, ignoring the shocked stares and whispers. I went straight to his sister and, in front of everyone, told her exactly what I thought. I didn't hold back, laying out the years of manipulation and how her control over her brother had cost me my marriage. I recounted how she'd faked an emergency during my labor and shattered any chance I had at a happy family. The silence was deafening. My husband stood there, paralyzed, while his sister tried to feign innocence, claiming I was making things up to cause drama. But the faces around her told a different story. I could see the doubt in their eyes, some relatives looking at her as if, for the first time, they were beginning to see through her act. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. But the real surprise came when his mother, of all people, spoke up. She admitted she'd had suspicions about her daughter's motives for years. She confessed that she'd seen similar behavior but hadn't wanted to disrupt the family harmony. Seeing my husband's shocked face, she revealed that this wasn't the first time his sister had caused a rift in a relationship. She finally admitted, out loud, that his sister's obsession had ruined lives before. This admission marked the first time my husband's family had publicly acknowledged the toxicity that had been quietly simmering beneath the surface for years. I watched as my husband's face went from shock to something close to shame. He finally seemed to grasp the enormity of what had happened, how he had allowed his sister to manipulate him, not only now but over a lifetime. The fallout was swift. Relatives began questioning his sister, others offering apologies to me, realizing the depth of what I'd endured. His sister tried to shift blame, claiming I'd overreacted, that she never meant any harm. But the room was no longer filled with blind supporters. I'd planted seeds of doubt, and it was clear that her influence was beginning to crack. As I left the party, I felt an odd sense of closure. I knew this wasn't the end of the battle, but it was the first time I'd seen real cracks in their facade. My husband's family was finally beginning to see the truth. But for me, it was too little too late. The damage was done, and I had no intention of giving him a second chance. My husband tried one last time, begging me to forgive him, to believe he could change. But I was done listening to promises that would inevitably be broken. I told him that I couldn't be with someone who had allowed his family to destroy everything we'd built, who had chosen his sister's lies over our marriage. And this time, I walked away without looking back, finally free from a toxic cycle I should have left behind long ago. What I hadn't anticipated was the storm that would follow. After that party, the fallout was more dramatic than I could have ever anticipated. For once, the family had to confront years of denial, excuses, and blind loyalty. The truth had settled in, rippling through them in ways I hadn't expected. Soon, calls started flooding in, not just from family but from distant friends and even acquaintances who'd heard about what happened. People were shocked, both by the extent of his sister's manipulations and by my husband's willingness to stand by her side all those years. Days after I walked away, my husband started showing up at my door, practically begging for forgiveness. He had realized, too late, that his family's loyalty to his sister had cost him something far more valuable. He swore he would cut ties with her, that he'd make it up to me, do anything to repair what was left of our relationship. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't love driving him. It was desperation, the fear of losing the stability he'd grown so accustomed to. Then, a twist I hadn't seen coming. His sister herself reached out to me.
Not to apologize, of course.
No, she wanted to know how I dared expose her in front of the entire family. Her tone was biting, full of fury and disbelief that I'd broken the family code by confronting her at the party. In her eyes, I was the villain. The audacity. She accused me of tearing the family apart and trying to turn her own relatives against her. It was like she couldn't see beyond her own ego to realize that her actions had done that all on their own. But instead of anger, I felt an odd sort of pity for her. She had wrapped herself so tightly around her brother's life that she couldn't even recognize her own flaws. It was clear that without him by her side, she felt vulnerable and exposed. For the first time, I saw her for who she truly was, not a powerful force controlling her family, but someone terrified of being left behind, desperate to control everything around her because she feared she'd have nothing if she didn't. As the dust settled, the unexpected kept unfolding. Word spread to other members of their extended family who hadn't been at the party. Some of them reached out to me, apologizing for the years of silence, the times they'd turned a blind eye to the sister's behavior just to keep the peace. I learned that her meddling had affected others before me, that I wasn't the only one who had been caught in her web of manipulation. People began opening up about incidents from the past, things they'd brushed off at the time, but now saw in a different light. Then came a final, surprising twist. I received a letter, an actual handwritten letter, from his grandmother, a woman I'd met only a handful of times but always respected. She told me she'd seen my strength and integrity in facing what others hadn't dared to. She admitted she'd known for years about the favoritism, the excuses made for his sister, and the way my husband had been groomed to protect her at any cost. She confided that she had even tried, years ago, to pull him aside and warn him, but he had brushed it off, too deeply entangled to see reason. Her letter was full of encouragement, a reminder that walking away wasn't just brave, it was right. She urged me to find happiness outside of the chains that family had tried to place on me. Her words were a lifeline in the storm, and for the first time, I felt completely validated, like someone truly understood the weight of my decision. I realized then that even within that family, there were people who saw the truth. They just hadn't had the courage to speak up before. In the weeks that followed, I focused on moving forward. I built a life for myself and my child, one free from toxic influences and endless excuses. I no longer felt the sting of betrayal when I thought of my husband or his family. Instead, I felt relief, an overwhelming sense of freedom. The life I was building was one of my own choosing, free from anyone else's manipulation. Then, just as I was settling into my new normal, I received a final piece of news. His sister had distanced herself from their family, claiming that they had abandoned her after the truth came out. It seemed that once her hold over my husband broke, her family stopped giving her the unearned loyalty they'd provided for years. Relatives who'd once defended her blindly now saw her as the cause of years of dysfunction. She was left to face her own consequences, stripped of the allies she had so carefully cultivated. Ironically, it was her own need for control and attention that finally isolated her. She had played a long game, manipulating those closest to her to maintain her position as the center of attention. But in the end, she was alone, the very thing she'd feared most. And as for my husband, he tried one last time to reconnect, but I saw it for what it was, a desperate attempt to hold on to something familiar in a world he no longer controlled. I told him, gently but firmly, that the chapter between us was closed. The story we shared was over, and I wouldn't allow him to drag me back into a life of lies and manipulation. Looking back, I realized that breaking free was the best decision I could have made. I may not have seen it coming, but that fateful moment during labor opened my eyes to a reality I could no longer ignore. Walking away didn't just give me peace, it gave me power. For the first time, I was in control of my own life, unburdened by anyone else's expectations or demands. As I move forward, I feel stronger, more resilient. I'm free to be the kind of mother, friend, and person I want to be, without anyone else's shadow hanging over me. And that, more than anything, is the real victory, the one I never saw coming.